Yo guys, what is up? Moxsy here on our Diablo 4 video, and today I've got the privilege of presenting you with one of the craziest Necromancer builds, and I think is going to be the best build for the Abatoir of Zir, which is coming out in a few weeks. Now, this build is hitting for upwards of 32 million damage in Nightmare 100s with a Corpse Explosion Infinimus setup. However, we're not scaling our dot damage at all. We're scaling something very differently. In addition to that, this build, enemies currently don't have enough health in the game for this build to truly ramp up its damage. This build is hitting 72 million on the test dummies because we can properly ramp up our damage. By the time we've ramped up all of our damage, everything else is dead. However, in the Abatoir of Zir, we already know that that's going to be going up at a base level of Nightmare 100. Like level 1 is the easiest, and that's going to be level 100, and there's going to be a ton of levels. So I think this build not only is going to be great for Abatoir of Zir because it's going to have a ton of survivability, but it'll also have enemies that are healthy enough to ramp up its absurd levels of damage, hitting for over 72 plus million damage. And so yeah, this build's crazy. Let's get right into it. So the very first thing that we need to do is give proper credit to the build creator. This build was created by Seroc. He's a viewer of mine. He watched me back in the Borderlands 3 days and was like, hey, I know you like big damage. I'm doing some crazy damage on Necromancer. Do you want to see the build? And I looked at it and I was like, this is insane. Good work. Would you be willing to like showcase the build on the channel? So this is not a build that I created. However, I am on the account so that I can show you everything that you need to know about this build and why what Seroc has put together is so freaking strong. So the biggest thing to understand with this build is we are using Corpse Explosion. We are a like Infinimus build. However, we're not scaling dot damage at all. What we are scaling is X-Fall's Corroded Signet. Now, this is an item that I've made a few build guides with. When it procs, can hit for a lot of damage on like Seroc and Druid. It can do a lot of damage. However, Necromancer's got a lot of ways to scale this damage really high, way higher than I ever could on Seroc and way higher than I could on Druid. And there's two reasons for that. One, Necromancer has so many ways to apply additional dots. X-Falls, we wouldn't really care about if it was only proccing once every like 30 seconds. However, on this build, we're using 4 different dot sources. We don't only have the dots from Corpse Explosion, we have 4 other individual dot sources so that we're giving ourselves the most chance to proc X-Fall's Corroded Signet. On top of that, we're not scaling dot damage. What we are scaling is crit damage. We're currently sitting at over 790% crit damage on this build. We've got a ton of crit chance. We're over 50% crit chance when we proc our Corpse Tendrils. And so what we're working towards is giving us not only the highest damage procs of X-Falls, but consistent procs so that the build feels really good to not only go against bosses, but also mobs and nightmare dungeons. So real quick, the 4 sources of dot damage that we're using is Bone Storm. Lidless Wall gives us a ton of Bone Storms, and with the ultimate shadow aspect, it turns into a darkness skill, which is going to do shadow damage over time. The shadow damage over time, even though it doesn't say, can lucky hit, and it can proc X-Falls. That is one source. The next source is going to be our Blood Mist. Blood Mist leaves desecrated ground that deals shadow damage over time per second. This also can proc X-Falls. That's 2 sources of X-Fall explosions. Next up, we're going to be using Corpse Explosion. Corpse Explosion with the like shadow does the miasma, shadow damage over time. That is 3. And the 4th is we're going to be weaving in Blights. This is not a skill that you need to spam. It lasts for 6 seconds on the ground. We're just going to be casting it every once in a while. And that is our 4th source. All of these have seemingly their own individual proc chances of X-Falls, giving us the most optimal uptime of X-Fall procs. Now that you kind of understand what we're going for with the build, let's go over the gear specifics. So to start us off, we're using Godslayers. Godslayers gives us a massive damage multiplier when we pull in enemies with our Corpse Tendrils. I'll be going over the rotation after we finish the gear so that you know the specific rotation to go into, but Godslayers, massive damage increase whenever we're doing those big crowd controls with Corpse Tendrils. That's kind of our big damage window. Next up on our chest piece, we've got armor, damage reduction, and each time that Bone Storm damages an enemy, we gain barrier equal to 5% of our base life for 10 seconds. We are able to get away with some damage on our chest piece simply because we are like an Infinimus build. So we spend a lot of time not actually taking any damage from enemies, but if you're feeling squishy, you can always go for more armor or more survivability here, more DR. Next up on our gloves, we're using the Shadow Blight aspect. You deal 120% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. Now, one of the big questions is, why is this not on the amulet? And that decision simply boils down to uptime. This aspect that gives us the massive damage multiplier is only active after Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times, which is not up as often as our Corpse Tendrils is. Yes, Corpse Tendrils does have a cooldown. However, when we're using Decrepify with the lucky hit, enemies hit while afflicted with Decrepify have a 15% chance to reduce our active cooldowns by 1 second. There's no internal cooldown on this. We've got a bunch of sources of lucky hit that are constantly going to be giving us all of our cooldown back. So Corpse Tendrils is up on this build basically 100% of the time. And when it's up all this time, we're getting that massive increase to our crit chance and our crit damage multiplier. And once again, we're scaling a bunch of our crit damage. If we're not critting, we're not taking advantage of our 790% increased crit damage. And so that's why we are currently using the Corpse Tendrils on the amulet, just simply for a bit more quality of life damage uptime than the massive damage multiplier from the Blighted Warlord. Speaking of damage, we've got Tibalt's Will. Once again, while we're unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, we're going to be getting a 40% damage multiplier. This is massive. We don't really care too much about the resources, mainly because we're going to be constantly consuming corpses, so we're getting a lot of our resource back from that. However, this damage increase is so good. If you don't have Tibalt's, like you obviously, it's not a required unique for this build, but it's going to massively improve your damage. For our boots, we're using willpower plus movement speed and double resistances. We currently have res cap for everything, and the boots are a great spot to fill out those extra reses. We're also using willpower so that we can hit all of our Paragon nodes. This is a 540 willpower requirement for Powerhouse for another 25% increased damage while healthy, which we're basically always going to be on this build. And so that's why we've got willpower on our boots. And Ghostwalker aspect, Necro is a bit slow. More movement speed just makes the build feel better. For our weapon, we're going to be using a wand for the inherent 15% lucky hit chance. Lucky hit, once again, very important for this build. And we've got intelligence, crit damage, vulnerable, and damage to shadow damage over time affected enemies. We're looking for damages that are going to be active all the time. We don't care about dot damage once again. And we're scaling our crit, vulnerable, and damage to shadow damage as much as possible. We're not using a Black River on this build simply because Black River removes corpses. Black River would be great if we were scaling our dot damage, but the less corpses on the ground, the less chance that we have at proccing our X-Falls, so we're not going to be using Black River on this build, which also allows us to use the Lidless Wall, which gives us all these Bone Storms, and all the Bone Storms are another chance or another source of our lucky hit procs for our X-Falls. On the amulet, as I said earlier, we're using Grasping Veins. The most important thing on your amulet here is the Ranks of Gloom passive. Gloom right now is giving us a ton of damage. Gloom reads, when you damage enemies with darkness skills, they take 12% increased damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. This is a 36% increased damage. And remember, this is in shadow damage. The X-Falls procs in whatever damage element is what it triggered it, and all of our sources of damage are shadow damage. We've got Bone Storm, shadow damage. We've got Blood Mist, shadow damage. We've got Blight, shadow damage. We've got Corpse Explosion, shadow damage. So everything that we're doing is going to be that shadow damage, so we don't have to worry about it proccing in like a different element and then not fully scaling it. So Gloom is best there. And then we've got on our rings, crit chance, really important, and lucky hit chance are the two most important stats. Crit damage and vulnerable are obviously great stats to scale, which we're scaling on our weapon as well, but crit chance and lucky hit are the two most important stats. And then lastly, X-Falls Corroded Signet, must-have piece of this build, otherwise it just wouldn't work at all. Once again, this is a no minion build, so we're using the sacrifice bonuses. We're using the Reapers for the 15% increased shadow damage, but no longer use Skeletal Warriors. On our Skeletal Mages, we would deal 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, but you can no longer raise Skeletal Mages. And for the Golems, we're using you deal 30% increased critical strike damage, but lose the ability to summon a Golem. All things that are just scaling our damage as much as possible. So I'm just going to do a little damage rotation and then I'll walk you through it. So to start, do some Corpse Explosions. Pop that, pop this. I think I just saw a 50 million on that little damage rotation. So slowing this down real quick, we did hit a ton of like 50 millions, 49 millions, 55 millions. And all of this has to do with timing. So we've got a lot of big damage increases, a lot of big damage multipliers. And if you can time them all properly, which I did pretty well there, not the best, but I did pretty well, you can see some of these ridiculous amount of damage numbers. And so what is this actual rotation? So to start, I did a few corpse explosions. This is going to proc our fueled by death, and it's going to proc our gloom. This is when we consume 5 corpses. As you can see, I'm stacking up there 3, and then I stack up there 5. Then I've got the big damage increase. As soon as I do that, then I'm going to cast my corpse tendrils to pull in everything. Decrepify now is my big damage window. I'm going to go into my blood mist. Going into my blood mist makes me unstoppable, which is going to give me to bolts, and we just proc corpse. And then now in here is my big damage like window. And then if you have your alt up, you can throw your alt into this rotation. If not, you just do this normal rotation. But basically, you're just proccing your corpse explosions. You are either dashing or blood masting, decrepifying, and corpse explosion, and you're just trying to do things relatively quickly so that you can have this as much damage as possible. For our vampiric powers, we're going to be using Sanguine Brace, more survivability, and more crit chance for this build. Prey on the Weak gives us increased damage to vulnerable. Undying gives us more healing. We've got a ton of damage increases while we're healthy, so Undying is kind of a must-have. We've got Metamorphosis so that we give ourselves unstoppable every time that we're dashing, which gives us our damage increase from our Tabalts. And then lastly, we've got Domination. Every time that we're using Corpse Tendrils, we're going to be pulling in enemies and stunning them and making them vulnerable. So Prey on the Weak plus Domination when we use our Corpse Tendrils is a massive damage increase. For the skill tree, we're not using a basic skill, so just put 2 points anywhere to get down the tree. Then we're going into Blight. Once again, we are not scaling dot damage, so the ranks of Blight does not matter. What we're using is Supernatural Blight. We deal 15% increased damage to enemies that are within Blight, and Blight is another damage over time for our Exfall procs. Then we've got Corpse Explosion. We are putting points into Corpse Explosion simply because Corpse Explosion is going to be up all the time, like it is when Exfalls isn't proccing. It's our only real big source of damage. So in between procs, Corpse Explosion can help us do more damage, but ranks here is not like massively important. It's not like we need like 15 ranks of Corpse Explosion to be able to do damage on this build. Blood Mist leaves corpses. Obviously, we need to have as many corpses up as possible. Then we've got Fueled by Death. Whenever we consume these corpses, we're going to get that damage increase. Here we come over to Decrepify. Decrepify is giving us all of our cooldowns for our Bone Storm, for our Corpse Tendrils, and then Amplify Damage. We're going to deal more damage to those cursed enemies. Next up, Corpse Tendrils with the guaranteed vulnerable. Remember, we've got a lot of vulnerable damage, and so Corpse Tendrils is our big source of that. We're grabbing all of the shadow damage passives here, and then we're working our way down to Bone Storm. Bone Storm gives us a 20% more crit chance. We had like 25, so now when we use our Corpse Tendrils, that's another 30% crit, plus this is another 20%. We're sitting around over 70% crit chance on this build when Bone Storm is active, which once again, with the Lidless Wall plus Decrepify, it's basically up all the time. And then full sacrifice bonuses because we are not using minions. And lastly, Shadow Blight. Now, Shadow Blight can crit, and it does a lot of damage where it's not what we're scaling, like directly, but indirectly, Shadow Blights are also going to hit really hard on this build because they can crit, and we're scaling a lot of crit damage. And lastly, we get into our Paragon board. To start us off, in the first board, we've got the Sacrificial Glyph. We're mainly using this for the 10% increased damage while we have no active minions, which is just always up. And we're also going to be grabbing some extra damage and some more armor from that. Then we're working our way up to the Withered board. Once again, not a shadow damage over time build, so we don't need Wither. What we are putting in this board is Abyssal. Abyssal is going to give us that increased non-fizz damage, so more shadow damage, and we're also buffing up our shadow damage and our shadow resistances here. Then we're working our way into Flesh Eater. Flesh Eater is like a massive damage increase to this build. You're going to want to have Flesh Eater up as much as possible to see these big numbers. We're also grabbing Stifle for the more damage to injured enemies, more crit. And then we've also got Gravekeeper. Now, Gravekeeper in the Flesh Eater board boosts rare nodes, which is more resistances, which is great, but it's also boosting targeted a ton. 72% increased damage to elites is massive. Then we're working our way up into the Scent of Death board. Scent of Death is going to give us that damage reduction when we have corpses nearby, which is really nice. When there's no corpses nearby, we deal increased damage, but 15% damage reduction is really great here. We're also grabbing more crit damage from Corrective. We've got Rune for more damage to healthy enemies. We're also socketing Imbiber here for the more damage while healthy. We don't really care about the potion healing, but it's a ton more extra damage from Imbiber. More armor, more damage to injured enemies. Then we're working our way over to the Bloodbath node, where we're going to be socketing in Essence. Essence is going to give us increased crit damage, which is one of the stats that we care about most with this build. So we're going to be overstuffing it with Dex. We've got a ton of Dex here to get it to 49 out of 25 Dex, which gives us that 194% increased critical damage. Then grabbing Powerhouse for more damage while healthy. We don't care about the overpower damage. We're just grabbing all of our damage to healthy, damage to injured multipliers or additives. And then lastly, we've got the Bone Graft board. Bone Graft is a great spot for our exploit. We do not care about our resistances anymore because we've got full resistances. I don't know why I can't pronounce resistances right now. Sorry, I'm really struggling. Then we've got Shaper of Bone. We don't need the bone skill damage, so we're just putting enough to get exploit for that damage increase to vulnerable enemies. And then whenever we deal damage to vulnerable enemies, which is anytime that we are pulling in with our tendrils, we're going to get another damage multiplier. Guys, that is going to do it for the build video. I hope you enjoyed. If you're sitting on a build that you really like, that you don't think other people are playing or using, or you think other people should know about, feel free to shoot me a Discord DM or a Twitter DM. No guarantee that I'll see it, but I really do appreciate Seroc sharing this build with me because I think it's awesome, and I'm also just really strapped for time right now. I know that you guys want barb builds and rogue builds and necro builds from me, and I'm working on it. I'm leveling up my barb right now, but making these builds does take a ton of time. I really like taking my time to make the best builds possible, and so having people share their builds with me on characters that I haven't gotten to yet really does help me out. So yeah, guys, I will catch you all on the next one. Go check out Seroc. I will link his website, Twitch, YouTube, anything that he wants linked down in the description, and I'll catch you all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.